In this video, we're going to go through round one of a recent over-the-board tournament I played called the Rochester Masters Invitational. We had 7 masters and 1 strong expert, and I'm playing Tim Radermacher in this first round with the white pieces. He's a former Minnesota State champion and current Minnesota senior champion. I started d4. I've also played e4 and knight f3 in the past, but the reason I chose d4 here is because I felt most confident in the d4 lines and I wanted to play solid. Tim played d6, and here I was thinking if I play c4, my standard move, he may play this line e5, and I've played this before from the black side, and I actually kind of prefer black's position. After d takes e, in the queen trade, this position's actually about equal, and my feeling is it's more fun to play for black. Like, I would rather be on the black side of this position. So after d6, I played knight to f3, and that stops this quick e5 idea. Tim played knight f6, c4, knight d7, and now I think the plans here are pawn to e5, pawn to g6, pawn to c6. So black's going to play a little bit passive in the beginning, and then use the pieces to counter my big center after he gets developed. I played knight to c3, planning on e4 next, e5, and then e4. So what I like here is this big space advantage. I have 3 pawns in the center, and if black takes on d4 and I take back with the knight, now there's no pawns on the 5th rank for black. I have 2 pawns on the 4th rank, knight's out, bishop's ready to develop. So from a development point of view, I really like this position so far. And the engine does say white's up around 1 point. Bishop to e7, bishop to e2, both sides castle, pawn to c6. Now the plan here for black is to tuck the queen onto c7 usually, and this c6 pawn defends b5 and d5. Those are the squares that this knight would potentially be going to. So the c6 pawn does a nice job defending those squares. And my plan is going to be to play rook e1 next. So I started with h3. Rook e1 is one idea, and then I should also mention bishop to e3 is probably even a bigger idea here. So by playing h3, what I'm doing is I'm getting ready to play bishop to e3, but defending against this knight hop to g4, threatening to take that bishop on e3. So that's the idea here. h3, defending the knight hop to g4. Rook to e8, bishop to e3, pawn to a6. Now, I've seen this structure before. I know the idea is pawn to b5, and I think my long-term plan is to play d5 in response. Put these pawns on light squares and have both of my bishops kind of pointing over to the queen side. And with the pawn structure pointing over to the queen side like this, the plan is usually to attack in that direction, attack over to the queen side. So I played queen to c2 here. This is a developing move. It helps defend the pawn on e4, and I'm connecting the rooks, getting ready to bring them into the game. One thing I didn't realize here was how strong it was to play a quick d5, and this is something I saw with Stockfish. After c takes d, I get that structure I want, both bishops pointing queenside, and if you look at these highlighted black pieces, they're all kind of stuck back here, and it's very hard to transfer them over to the queen side. So I think this would have given me a bigger advantage had I just gone for that immediate d5. And the reason I played queen to c2 is one of my big takeaways from previous games is that I don't develop my pieces enough before playing a move like d5, so that's always running through my mind. I wanted to get the queen out, put the rooks into the center, and then play d5. But I think this is something to learn from in the other direction. Look to play d5 early if you know that you want that structure. Black played b5, and here I played a3. This prevents b4 and also prepares playing b4 myself, getting an even bigger center. Bishop b7, rook d1, queen c7, both sides are developing. Rook a to c1, rook a to c8. And here I took on b5. I think pawn to d5 might even be stronger, but this move should be okay too. C takes d. Now here, black could play e takes d first. The engine prefers that slightly. Tim played c takes d back, which is what the move that I expected in the game. And now I played d5. So I was able to get this structure that I wanted. And the next move or two for Tim actually really got me thinking, because after queen to b8, what I'm thinking here is This is the bad bishop for black, and I saw this idea, bishop d8 to b6, threatening to trade off for my good bishop. And you do have to be careful in these Philidor type positions, because if white doesn't use the space advantage early on, usually black's able to maneuver the pieces around, create a few trades, and then they may find positional weaknesses in the white camp because the pawns get overextended. So that's something that I had to think about too. And I played pawn to b4. After bishop to d8, I see this idea, trade the bad bishop, the bishop on the color of these pawns, for my good bishop, opposite color of my pawns, and I decided I need to play quickly here, and I played pawn to a4. I'm just trying to blast open the queen side and make it so that this light square bishop can come back to life, which is now pressuring this b pawn, currently attacked by my a pawn. So after b takes a, queen takes a4, bishop to b6, offering a trade of these dark bishops. I calculated this and I thought a nice combo might be to take the bishop and play queen to a5, which will force that knight to retreat, and then I can continue with my queenside plan. So I didn't think there was anything better than capturing here. I don't want to retreat this bishop. I don't want to defend it. So I took queen a5, hits the knight, threatens to win the pawn on a6 soon. But I can't take this right away because after bishop takes, there's queen takes b4, and black actually has the advantage here. So I can't be too quick to take a6, but that's something that we both need to calculate every move until this threat is gone. So I played knight to d2 here, and I really liked this move during the game. It defends the d pawn, the e4 pawn twice, and both of these knights now have the option to move as long as the other knight defends e4. Rook e to d8, and here I played queen to a3. I like this move because it's flexible. The queen could potentially swing over to the king side, and it prepares moves like knight to a4, maybe bring the knight out here, knight to c4. It also defends the rook on c1. So if black is, for example, going to double on the c file, it's nice to have an extra defender on c1 if my c3 knight were to move out of the way. Knight to f8 was played, knight to c4, eyeing this pawn, also looking at these dark squares. Knight to g6, and now I'm starting to think, okay, Tim's coming over here. f4 is probably the bigger hole. h4, though, is also a potential square for that knight. So I played g3, shutting down this knight. And here Tim played a very nice move, h5, and I didn't react well to this. I definitely should have played h4. And the reason I didn't, I just thought that it gave this knight a nice square on g4. But really the knight on its own isn't creating any problems here. I shouldn't be afraid of that knight on g4. I should be more afraid of this h-pawn pushing up to h4, opening this up. Because if this diagonal opens up, my f-pawn takes on g3, that's no fun. I really need to keep those dark squares defended, and h4 for me was the way to do it. So I played rook to b1. A big mistake, I think. Pawn to h4, and now all of a sudden you see these red squares highlighted. This whole diagonal is opened up after h takes g happens, and when my f-pawn takes back, I'm no longer able to play pawn to f3, defending the pawn on e4. So I played b5. I thought I have to play quickly on the queen side. I see this kingside action happening, and now according to the engine, this is close to equal. So black is right back in the game. So I definitely should have played 25 h4. A takes b, rook takes b. So even though the engine is saying equal, during the game I think both Tim and I felt that white has a pretty big advantage here. You see this b7 bishop is pinned, the other rook is ready to come over, the queen may come down soon. And I think what we both underappreciated was the fact that black has some nice counterplay on the c file, and it's because these knights are potentially weak. The one on c4 is barely guarded, the one on c3 is barely guarded, and there's already a rook on c8. So in the game, Tim played queen to c7, but the strongest move is actually h takes g, and after f takes, rook c7, very nice move. After rook d to b1, now queen to c8, double attacking the knight and the h3 pawn. So this would have been very good for black, and if I play king g2, rook takes c4, bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes b7, black is down the exchange, but the engine says equal, and there's actually a lot of play for black. Queen can come to d3, and look at this vulnerable king on g2. All because I didn't play pawn to h4. That king is wide open. Way too exposed. So after queen to c7, this gave me some chances. Queen to a7, double attacking the bishop. Bishop back to a8. And here I decided this black queen is really the source of counterplay for black. I decided to take it off and then try to wrangle this bishop afterwards. So I played rook d to b1, and you can see it's very hard to get that bishop into the game, and I may even try to trap it with rook to b8. So king h7 was played, and here I took a move to just play solid, rook 1 to b3. H takes, f takes, knight e7, and now I played rook to b8. So if rook takes b8 and I take back, rook to c8 could still be played. And this is what happened. Rook takes b8, rook takes b8. But here Tim decided on knight takes e4. And I think the reason why is because after rook to c8, I can play a move like rook to b6. And let's say this knight moves back, rook to a6. Rook is heading to a7. This d-pawn could be picked up almost any time. And really black is not having any fun here. And at this point we were under time pressure, both under 5 minutes. And I think Tim went with a practical decision. Let's try to grab a couple pawns for this piece on a8. So he's sacrificing, well, he's actually sacrificing the knight and trying to grab 2 pawns for it. And this does give Tim a slight initiative. And if all my pawns get traded off, my winning chances are actually very low, even if I'm up a piece. So I think it was a good practical decision, and it really made me think without a lot of time on the clock. So here I played knight takes e4, bishop takes d5, and we can see currently it's 2 pawns for the piece. I play knight e takes d6, so now it's 1 pawn for the piece. And what I was trying to do here was keep my pieces very active. So we did have a 30-second increment. Time control was 60 plus 30. I was trying to keep those pieces as active as possible. That was my goal, and try to keep creating threats. So here I'm threatening to play knight takes e5, winning a pawn back. So knight to c6 was played, and now rook to b5. This attacks the bishop and also eyes this pawn on e5. Bishop takes c4. I took with the bishop. I felt this was the most active, threatening the f pawn. Knight to d4. Now I do have to be careful. Rook takes e5 runs into a knight to f3 check fork. So I put the rook on to b6. What I like about this is it kind of cuts off the black king, and I still keep the threat on f7. So if that king moves up, he has to watch out for discovered checks. f6, and here I felt it was a good time to bring the king up, and I'm trying to avoid any checks from the knight. King to h6, and here I played rook to b8. What I like about this is that all of a sudden there's mating nets in the air as well. Rook can check from behind, bishop can check on the light squares. These pawns are creating this sort of fortress or wall on the other side of the black king, so it can't come down to my side of the board. And here black plays pawn to f5, but now I have this nice combo, knight f7 check, and the e-pawn drops. So this was due to time pressure, but also positional pressure. I was able to put my pieces on very active squares, and it's very hard to find a way out of this for black. So after knight f7, king g6, I calculated that knight takes e5 check could potentially get messy. After king to f6, king attacks my knight, rook attacks my bishop. I didn't want to deal with that. So I inserted rook to b6 check first, with the idea of knight takes e5 next. But after king to h7, there's actually a forced checkmate in 3, knight g5. And Tim resigned here, because the king goes back to h8, and then rook to b8 check, block, and checkmate. So this was round 1, the Masters Invitational Tournament. You know, I think this was a very good game by both sides. I was definitely pressuring Tim the whole way, but Tim had a very nice idea with that, bringing the knight over to g6, h5, h4, and he was back in the game. And I think he might have been pushing for an advantage somewhere around that point until he played a mistake with queen to c7, doing this line h takes g, f takes g, and rook c7 was a very nice idea for black. And I think my takeaway is definitely move 25, pawn to h4, and on move 10, pawn to d5. I think those were the biggest things for me to learn from. The number 1 takeaway, though, is that pawn to h4 move. making sure that my king stays safe before I do the queenside play. All right, so that was round 1 recap. I will have a recap coming up for round 2 and round 3. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.